Say Chris Elward.
So now I give the floor to Chris Elward, our national president.
Hey, Jill. Bonsoir, tout le monde. Jill.
Thank you, Jill. Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you. I would first like to say that I'm here in Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples.
Us tonight on this, PSAC's Treasury Board bargaining national panel on equity in the workplace. Tonight's panel, we're going to focus on the fight at the Treasury Board bargaining tables to create an equitable and inclusive workplace. We will also be discussing the impacts winning these demands would have on our members and why it's important that we all mobilize and support our bargaining teams so that we can win. And at the end of the panel, you will have a chance to participate in a joint digital action to support the fight for equity in the workplace. And I would ask you all to please participate in that. Every round of bargaining is important. You all know that. But this one is especially crucial to our members, of course, because of the pandemic. Our members have worked tirelessly these past 2 years to keep delivering essential public services to millions of Canadians under the difficult conditions created by COVID-19. PSAC members and all workers are facing soaring inflation and unique health and safety issues while they get the job done. Workers are also facing something else brought to light by the pandemic: inequity, racism, and discrimination. None of these challenges are new. For years, our members have faced and overcome experiences of discrimination. Union activists have fought for social justice and equitable workplaces, and PSAC has won several human rights victories. But the pandemic exposed the numerous inequities that have gone unchecked in our communities and workplaces, and made us reflect more deeply on the racial injustices caused by systemic discrimination, and especially here in Canada, our history with colonialism. For the Union, the pandemic has confirmed the need for us to develop a full-scale response and make the pursuit of equity our top priority. Equity must be an integral part of everything we do, because your identities are an integral part of who you are. So while PSAC has been negotiating our next collective agreements with Treasury Board, we have been examining the language from an inclusive lens. We have tabled new and revised provisions within the discrimination and sexual harassment articles to ensure our members have access to a fair process. We are also calling for all federal public sector workers and managers to complete mandatory facilitator-led training on anti-oppression and discrimination, harassment and violence in the workplace, and Indigenous history that aligns with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action number 57. Last week, Treasury Board outright rejected our proposal on mandatory equity training. Today, we called them out publicly on their hypocrisy. This government claims they are making equity issues a top priority. Yet, when they are presented with a concrete opportunity to do better, they dismiss it. We won't let them pay lip service to equity issues and not back it up with real action. Holding the employer to account, just like we did today, is exactly what we'll be discussing tonight. And I'm so very happy that you all joined us this evening. You will be hearing from 4 great panelists this evening. Sharon D'Souza, of course you all know Sharon as our National Executive Vice President. Sharon is also the Alliance Executive Officer leading PSAC's Anti-Racism Action Plan. You'll also hear from Christina McLean. Christina is an SV bargaining team member, and Christina works with the Department of National Defense. Brenda Shillington, PSAC negotiator for the PA and Common Issues tables. And we'll also hear from Jimmy Theodore, the research officer supporting our Treasury Board bargaining teams. So first up from our panelists will be Sharon. So I want to welcome Sharon to the virtual stage. Sharon, over to you.
So much, Chris. And I want to say hello to everyone. And I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. But before I begin, I want to first start with acknowledging that I'm joining you all from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I'm grateful to speak from this land and commit myself to the struggle against the systems of oppression that have displaced Indigenous people of their lands and has denied them of their right to self-determination. PSAC has been at the forefront for fighting for equity, whether it's been in the fight for same-sex benefits, parental leave, equal pay, and more. PSAC has been there. A successful labor movement is one in which every one of us is respected and treated with equity and dignity. What makes our union work is the solidarity of its members, that collective desire to fight for something greater. Equity requires us to recognize that not all of us have experienced the same barriers in life. And so we need to understand that each of us need to be met where we are based on our unique experiences. You know, we can take a look back to the 1980s. When on September 20th, 1980, 10,000 clerical and regulatory workers walked off the job due to frustrations from the way negotiations were going with the employer. At the time, the CRs, which made up of 75% women, of which 57% were under the age of 35. A tentative agreement was finally reached on October 8th, after a 30-hour bargaining session. The deal worked out to a 24.8% increase over 2 years. It also included substantial gains when it came to family care, including paid maternity leave for the 2-week period not covered by employment insurance. This was a historical event for our union, which was rooted in the fight for equal pay, where many women and young workers were being disproportionately impacted. It is only recently that Pay Equity Act came into effect. I'm talking about last year, August 31st. We have been at the table fighting for this legislation, which pushes all federally regulated employers to partner with unions to implement pay equity plans within the next 3 years, with the goal of closing systemic pay discrimination gaps. This, a huge victory and a long-awaited one. History shows us that we have made many gains, but that we've begun with incremental wins that then translated into victories for us all. Not just unionized workers, but for all workers. Equity and human rights is not just about the responsibility of those belonging to a particular equity group. We know that when we achieve these victories at the bargaining table, it trickles down to victories for us all, much like when we saw the CR strike and then now the Pay Equity Act. We continue to witness injustices, and the pandemic has exacerbated many of the inequities that persist. We need to recognize that we need to be leaders in creating change, and that we can create change. The employer may talk a big talk about creating an inclusive workplace, but it begins with ensuring that the most marginalized communities are being respected and included. This is work. I'm not saying it's easy work, but it requires us all to let go of our egos and lead with empathy. That means looking at how we can create an anti-racist workplace. And PSAC continues to raise issues with staffing to Treasury Board, but they've yet to hear us. We need them to put an end to non-advertised appointments and positions. The best fit criteria has got to go. Even the formal and informal recourse mechanisms available to staff has a host of barriers and lack transparency. And it's simply unfair. We've heard from many of our members, the assessment tools used in competitions are arbitrary and discriminatory. And finally, this employer must respect foreign credentials and experiences. It took this government over 20 years to get to work and start reviewing the Employment Equity Act, despite us calling on the government to do so, and despite them having an obligation to do it every 5 years. We recently put out a survey to our members and had over 5,000 respond. These are your responses, and we've gathered them and analyzed them, and we'll be submitting it to the government. The employer must understand the importance of providing opportunities to learn about Indigenous realities and what the employer will do to work towards reconciliation. It must ensure our trans and non-binary members feel safe in the workplace, whether that's access to gender-neutral washrooms, providing a seamless process for name change, using gender-inclusive language in our collective agreements, and much more. Persons with disabilities continue to face barriers. The Accessible Canada Act was passed in 2019, and we continue to wait for this employer to do better. As union members, we have various tactics available to us to push for these systemic changes. One of the methods we can use is our collective agreement and collective bargaining. As I mentioned, many of the historical wins we've had is through collective bargaining. And that is why I want to encourage you all here today to use your collective power in moving the agenda on equity forward. Through collective bargaining and mobilization, it's been proven time and time again that this will result in a win for all of us. It will result in a more inclusive and equitable workplace. And this will only happen with our collective strength and solidarity. Thank you so much, and over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much for that, Sharon. Next up is Christina. Christina, to you.
Can everyone hear me? Equity in the workplace. One of the first ways I introduce myself now is as a survivor of intersectional discrimination. And the reason for that is so that other people who may have gone through something similar feel like they can come forward also. We get caught up in sweeping our lived experiences of trauma away. There is a lot of shame in trauma. And so instead, I am wearing my survivorship as a badge of honor. If there was an intersectional discrimination badge, I would wear it. Perhaps an idea for a future initiative. Other members need to know their stories are welcome and that there is a place for them in the union. I'm a member of the SV bargaining team, and I'm also a member of the Common Issues bargaining team. And as a bargaining team member, I am a champion of all intersectional discrimination training, being facilitated, led, and looked at with and through the lens of a survivor. This training includes anti-Blackness, anti-oppression, uncovering unconscious biases, decolonization, and many others also. Each bargaining team member adds their own special EQ, emotional quotient, and IQ, intelligence quotient, to the table. They bring their lived experiences and their own uniqueness. And championing intersectional education is something that I'm doing at the bargaining table. I am a woman in a non-traditional trade. Right? Just trying to get my cursor to go down. I am a woman in a non-traditional trade, both by being on tugs and as the first racially visible woman and working for D&D. I did not wake up one day knowing I was experiencing forms of intersectional discrimination. I did not understand that I was fighting a war on two fronts, both as a woman and as a racially visible person, which is why this intersectional education is so important for both the employer and the survivors. Survivors must be able to name their pain. This type of education allows for that. And the union helped me find my voice, name my pain, and help make sense of what I and others like me have been through. Now I'm going to share a bit of my experience, which includes sexual harassment, racial slurs, sexism, and discrimination on the basis of family status. If you are someone who has had those experiences and who may be triggered by my own story, I will be speaking about it for the next 2 to 3 minutes. Take care of yourself, as you need to be able to engage with this content. My story begins working on tugs over 15 years ago. When I first started, the guys would call the bollard on the boat the ensler head. When I corrected them and told them that the bit on the ship had a proper name, it was called the bollard or the head bit, I asked for them to stop using the slur around me, as it hurt me. And I believe this moment is important because this was maybe the first moment I unwittingly drew attention to myself. I was unknowingly making myself a target. And this one captain seemed to revel in referring to me as the ensler after that. One of the other bosuns would say, "She isn't an ensler, she's a camel jockey or a raghead." This same captain also called me a "see you next Tuesday" while I was working on his ship. And he was my supervisor. I expected some of the rough talk from my colleagues, but I was surprised captains and other supervisors behaved this way. When I first showed up on the docks, my son was very small and I was still breastfeeding. I had nowhere I could pump. The heads weren't working on the vessels. The guys were comfortable relieving themselves over the side of the boat on ships I was initially tasked to. I was trying to find a space to pump and I couldn't let down properly because letting down requires the body to relax. So I wasn't able to pump at the right time of day or relax. I was putting maxi pads in my bra to hide the potential wet marks. And when I would burst, they were covered in blood at the end of a long shift. When I had to fight to get working heads, do you think I felt comfortable explaining that I needed to pump? My son went without. I just couldn't work there and breastfeed at the same time. This is one of my first major regrets. I found myself gravitating towards the engine room, although I came in planning on going deck side, but the engine room had less ridiculing and the captain, who was the worst offender, couldn't supervise me in the engine room. So I found myself altering my career path in order to feel safer. I began working in the engine room, which meant greasing the tank caps and covers. It meant putting on knee pads. When I would go on the deck, many of the men would, often started by the same said captain, would ridicule me and say, "While you're down there, hey, how about servicing me?" I got on with it and tried to complete the task as quickly as possible. I was so young, and in hindsight, I didn't know what to do. I would sheepishly laugh or walk away. I would feel ashamed in the quietness of my home, and I would cry myself to sleep. When I found out I was pregnant with my second child, I told my engineering supervisor, and his words were, "Well, you need to go home with no pay." I explained that such a thing as mat leave existed in the collective agreement. I asked them to find me a job in the office. But nope, I was still 6 months pregnant, humping 10-gallon drums of oil up and down ship's ladders. This was my second major regret. I risked the health of my children in an effort to fit in. My breaking point came when the very same captain asked how many ensler babies I was having. When I returned from mat leave, Yes, they found the entire section in the SB collective agreement. The very same captain, while intoxicated, exposed himself while operating a tugboat. In the end, I reported, and I was the only one disciplined. I was also removed from the tugs, and while the 2-year investigation went on, I was sent to work cleaning out poop tanks, literally poop tanks all around the base. I went from thinking I would become a captain to a 4th-class engineer to cleaning poop tanks. When the employer concluded the investigation, they felt they couldn't go back because there was too much harassment for me to go back. I felt I was being bullied out of the workplace. I took a demotion to go hand out basketballs in a gym where I still am today. When I asked to try and look after my mental health and requested a flex week in order to see my psychiatrist, I had to fight. I was scrutinized differently and further stigmatized. I wrote a letter to the CO describing how I felt, and I was charged with harassment, which was ultimately dropped. Up until the global apology, which we all watched from the Department of National Defense, I had only ever been told the words, "We are sorry," from one very kind CO. For years, I hid these stories. I felt shame. I denied a part of my history. And I finally decided that I have nothing to feel ashamed about. And the only shame would be for these useful stories of a lived experience, not to help other people, because these stories stayed in the shadows. Today, I know there is a difference between the producer of racism and the consumer of it. And I forgive many of the individuals who behaved the way they did or who didn't act. But I won't hide what happened to me anymore. With a department that has the infrastructure and activism, I know we can turn this ship around. And it starts with you believing me and believing another survivor who is brave enough to come forward. Feel, felt, found, listen to their feelings, respond back with what you think they felt, and find them where they're at, not ahead in the healing, but where a survivor is at. Lift while we rise. When you are moving forward, take a sister with you. Leave no one behind. If I help even one sister with my story, it was truly worth it. The union is our answer to fighting for equity in this workplace, in all workplaces. If I can have hope and total conviction that this is possible, then so can you. So remember to educate, advocate, and above all, activate activism. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you very much for that, Christina, and thank you for sharing that for sure. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Brenda Shillington and Jimmy Theodore. Brenda is a negotiator, and Brenda is the negotiator for the PA table and the Common Issues table. And Jimmy is a research officer for the Treasury Board units as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy to kick it off. Jimmy?
Merci, Chris. En fait,
Thank you, Chris. And good evening, everyone. This testimonial that you just heard, these comments, I hope will take you further than just moving you and will be interpreted as meaning that really important changes have to occur. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from a territory shared by the Anishinaabe and the Mohawk here north of Montreal. I'll try to address this question that you see on your screen. I hope you see it all. For English-speaking members, the presentation is shared or will be shared in the chat, and you can follow it in English. So the question is equity in the workplace. Why is it so important? I'll be making my presentation in French. So, why is it so crucial, so important to include equity in bargaining? I would like to refer to two recent surveys done by the PSAC. So this is the result of a survey organized by the program sector on equity. About 66% of members surveyed do not know or have not witnessed initiatives on equity, employment equity in the workplace. And so when you add the no's and the I don't know or I'm not sure, the rate is 66%. So the PSAC is reiterating how important it is to put equity first to create inclusive workplaces. Some people think that resolutions debated demands come from out of the blue. But no, they come directly from the members and the concerns that they have expressed. As I mentioned earlier, we're talking about surveys that were done to get a sense of what members want and need. I extracted a few words from these surveys. So fair and equitable wage increase, access to telework and obstacles to remote work, increase in workload and stress linked to COVID, problems with work-life balance, problems in getting ahead. You talked about harassment and discrimination. You talked about fears of contracting out and technological change, and also the Phoenix issue, of course, the Phoenix pay system issues. So I won't go over all of that in detail tonight, but I'll give you a few figures. Actually, this question, do you think that your present wage is fair compared to that of workers in similar sectors of the economy? What this means is that the issue of wages and inflation is even more crying for different members of equity groups. When we know that an average salary is about $65,000, $773.18, this graph shows clearly the discrepancy between a person that's racialized and the rest of the workforce. The average salary of a Black person, for instance, is $63,973, which means 3 to 6% less than the average salary. So the members of the PSAC want to keep their purchasing power. You want to keep your purchasing power. More than 70%, if you look at the graph, for each group has shown that inflation has had a huge effect on prices, and you expect your salary to allow you to continue to live decently. So it's up to 70% that equity group members feel that their experiences are not taken into account. They are given or dumped all kinds of other duties, so their experience at work are not fair. They get asked or dumped many other duties on their desk for which they receive no compensation. So these are wages before taxes, and they come from 2019. For about 2 years now, because of the pandemic, the members have had to overhaul their working methods, or the way they perform their work, with all of the problems that created. Based on these figures, this had a huge impact on mental health. It's also difficult to extract yourself from your work, where precarious working conditions at home may cause physical and mental harm. I'm sorry, and I'd like to express to all of those who contracted COVID that I feel for them, and I can only highlight how important vaccination is. Close to 35% of people surveyed said they sustained more stress because of the pandemic. Racialized members and Aboriginal members even more. We saw more and more anti-Asian racism, for instance, or some First Nations communities were cut from other communities and did not even get their basic needs satisfied. And so the types of obstacles that you met while working remotely or at home is the obligation of taking care of other family members while trying to work. 39.8% of respondents found that difficult. It was also difficult to include family and professional responsibilities to do them both. And it was difficult to get away from work at 39%. And it was 51% of members said it was difficult not to see your colleagues in person. So those are the answers that we got in the survey. Concerning your present position, how has your stress and anxiety level changed because of COVID? Mental health remains a huge issue there. Stress has increased. If you look at this, you see that it has increased and greatly increased, these two last categories. That's what you said. And that's why we have demands at the bargaining table on that. We also asked you, what has prevented you or hindered your advancement in the public service in the past? So the main responses are these. People talked about a conflict between work and family or personal obligations. Members talked about harassment as something that prevented them from getting ahead in the public service. About 39% of members say they were harassed in their workplace. Of course, for transparency's sake, I have to say that the question said, what prevented you from getting ahead in the public service in the past? Whereas the government asked you the same question pretty much, but per year, on a yearly basis. So the government said, in the last 12 months, were you victim of a harassment in the workplace? And their result is 11, 14, 15%. So in terms of the employer, everything is going well. What they're trying to show is that things are improving compared to our figures, which show that, yet again, people experience harassment. So when we asked members the nature of the harassment that they experienced, we have multiple responses. What is perceived as an unequitable treatment, of course, has a direct impact on morale to a level of 61%. So there were unfair comments, humiliation, excessive control, 45.6% and 44.5%. You will be surprised to see that physical violence still exists, even if the number is low, but still it's too much. Physical violence is unacceptable. It should not exist in the public service in 2021. I talked about obstacles and barriers earlier. We talked about harassment. There's also the issue of discrimination. Members have felt that they experienced discrimination, or have told us that they experienced discrimination. And it has a hugely devastating effect. Once again, about 20% of members surveyed said they experienced discrimination. Clearly, there again, of these 20%, Blacks have a rate of 53.7%. Members with a disability are at 46.42%. the nature of discrimination sustained? That was our next question. You know, the reasons in the legislation on discrimination. Well, I just want to show you that race is still used as a discrimination factor. Sex, 35%, age, 39%, disability, and family life or marital situation are all grounds for discrimination. Other concerns that you expressed to us, we asked you, do you fear that your work may change or that you may lose your job in the future because of technological change? Are you fearful that contracting out and technological change might hinder your work? And we saw that members are indeed concerned with job security because of tech change. And so the demands that are debated or discussed on bargaining committees come from these concerns that you expressed to us in the survey. In conclusion, the program sector and the bargaining section have received a mandate to find new wording to improve collective agreements, decolonize them, to improve, among others, bereavement leave, to add to the employment equity, to add to the nation-to-nation treatment of Aboriginals, a practical guide on language. These are all research underway, and that should yield results soon. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
We really appreciate that. I appreciate the comments from Sister D'Souza and McLean as well. And I'm now the boring part, which is language. So as Jimmy mentioned, we don't develop the proposals out of the air. We take very seriously the input that we receive through our bargaining survey. We also cross-reference against, as he mentioned, the employers survey, the broader Federal Public Service survey, which is only a snapshot of the previous 12-month period, and we look at, you know, in your entire employ with the Federal Public Service. We also look at the pressures related to legislative changes and other matters happening in the workplace and in society, and they can no longer be denied. Equity is something that we need to pay some additional attention to. Although we have fought on many fronts in that area, there are specific things that members have made it clear that we need to address. We've also been involved as a union with a joint task force on diversity and inclusion that Sister D'Souza was part of a number of years ago that came up with a number of recommendations, joint recommendations. The bargaining team had access to that as well and reviewed that to see how we could incorporate those into our proposals. That's been a valuable exercise of review, and then the follow-up on what's happened since then and how that has led to the development of the education materials that we actually, as Chris mentioned in his speech, have proposed or become a mandatory for delivery to federal public service workers. So in terms of the highlights of where we're going, in all of our proposals at the common issue table, all the tables are available online at the PSAC website under the bargaining tab. You can navigate that. If you have any difficulty locating that, speak to your local regional PSAC representative or even email the negotiations email. But in particular, the number one, the first thing is on what is currently called the no discrimination article. We don't propose any change to that, but we are adamant that we need to have much clearer language around the investigative process and make sure that members know that they have various recourse options available to them, whether it's grievance or a human rights complaint. But the specific things around the investigation, which we are also proposing in other language in the next article, is around specific requirements related to the selection of an investigator. So that some of the things you'll be looking at is their lived experience, not just their ability to be neutral or to be non-biased, but that they come from a similar or adjacent experience to perhaps what the complainant may be from as well. And that's where we're also introducing we introduced a proposal for mandatory training very clearly. And as Chris mentioned, and as Christina referred to as well, we're adamant that it needs to address anti-oppression, discrimination, and including intersectionality analysis. That it needs to be not just slides that you review online and then hit next, because people don't, certainly adults don't necessarily learn that way in terms of concepts. They may learn content for your job, for delivering the services that you do, but there's more involved, and people learn so much more when there's interaction, stories, situations as they develop, and people's learning and their development evolves, and that's what we're looking to support. Next, there's the article on sexual harassment, which we're proposed that it be renamed Harassment and Abuse of Authority. That's particularly in response to the changes under the Canada Labour Code around violence and harassment in the workplace. We're looking for those provisions to be referenced and strengthened within the collective agreement, and also introduce, again, the criteria for the selection of an investigator. And I want to be clear with folks, we also wanted to ensure that people know that they have access to the grievance procedure, a human rights complaint, as well as a complaint of a notice of occurrence under the Act, which doesn't give you individual remedy. Maybe this isn't a health and safety session, but doesn't give people individual remedy. It's a wake-up call for the employer and why this harassment or violence happened, how did it happen, what measures can you take to make sure that it doesn't happen again and protect workers in the future. And so we want to link in with the joint health and safety committees, and also mandatory training. Okay, on again on violence and harassment in the workplace, and on the processes. Next, we've wanted to introduce language that provides, it really comes from the work that Sharon and that group did a number of years ago on the Joint Task Force, and the recommendations from that has led to the development of some really new training at the Canada School. It's great that it's on a shelf, but right now it's not currently necessarily being offered or encouraged or any form of mandatory. And so that's one of the provisions that we're looking for: training on diversity and inclusion, employment equity, unconscious bias, as well as the implementation of Call to Action 57 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Chris referenced as well earlier. We're also looking for the introduction of leave for Indigenous practices for our Indigenous members. We've achieved this throughout many other collective agreements. We have over 320 collective agreements across the country, not just the federal public service bargaining units. We've been able to achieve that type of leave for at least the last decade in various units across the country. The Canada Labour Code recently changed to include that leave for this 10 unpaid days per year. And we're looking for that to be paid within this collective agreement. Currently, that workers in the federal public service do not have access to that leave. Even though it's in the Canada Labour Code, it does not apply to workers at Treasury Board. So we're looking for that to be included. So those are some of the major items that address equity, and you can see there's a large component of education and ensuring that the collective agreement spells things out to use it not only as an education tool for members, but especially for the employer and management. So, and I don't know if I have time to talk about the responses we've received from the employer. Chris did talk about it, but I wanted to give just some quotes from the employer just to leave with you. Our responses from Treasury Board have not been very encouraging. They're not prepared to insert them into the collective agreement, especially the training, the education. They say that they support Indigenous members, and they wonder, Indigenous members have options of all kinds of other leave that they could use for cultural Indigenous practices. Are they having trouble accessing it for that reason? Yes, they are. And they shouldn't have to use their other leave for Indigenous practices. And the employer said that they have a strong commitment to equity, but they do not require it to be in the collective agreement. So I'll just leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Merci, Jimmy, for both of your presentations. We're going to continue with just a couple of questions. I've just got a question, maybe a two-part question for each of the panelists. Before I get to that, though, I do want to mention something for all of you joining tonight. We are doing another virtual meeting tomorrow night at 7:30. And it's for young workers. And so in PSAC, young workers, of course, are 35 and younger. And so we're inviting all young workers to join us tomorrow at the 7:30 for discussion and brainstorming event. So it'll be around the same issue about equity in the workplace. So I'll mention that before we end, but I wanted to get that in there before I move to the questions. So the first question, Sharon, is for you. And the question is, how can we mobilize to support these demands that we have regarding equity and other demands at the bargaining table? And what does that look like in this current context of the pandemic? Sharon?
Thank you, Chris. And those are some very, very important questions. And I just want to acknowledge that, yes, the pandemic has been hard. We've had traditional tools of engaging in mobilization in the workplace. And for some, they're still in the workplace. For others, it's meant working from home. And so I just want to point out that what it looks like could look differently depending on where your workplace is, and it may have changed. So first of all, I want to say that you need to contact your regional office. It's important to get involved, and there's various panels that are coming up. As Chris mentioned, there is a panel tomorrow for young workers and looking at brainstorming ideas, but we also have a panel on February 24th at 7 p.m. about work-life balance. And, the main piece is we need to start the conversation, not, just because we send an email or, information is put on the website, it doesn't mean that everyone is reading it. Everyone's busy. They've got, life has changed. You may have childcare or elder care that you're responsible for. And so it's important to have those conversations with your coworker, have those one-on-one. And, at the end of it, we need everyone to step up to the plate. And it may look differently. Even though we are virtual, it means that you can still make calls, send text messages. You can, in fact, contact your Minister of Parliament and lobby, and you can engage remotely. As well as I know that locals are still having local events, whether it's a general meeting, invite the bargaining team members to the local meeting. And most of all, I would say that every region has various activities. I can tell you what's coming up. There will be hosting a mobilization summit, and I want to encourage you all to come out. An invitation will be coming out, so I hope you engage and be part of that mobilization plan and have your voice heard. There's also going to be every 2 weeks, there'll be actions around the 15th of the month to pressure the government on the bargaining issues. And most of all, I would have to say, we need to ensure that we are able to reach you and you're able to connect with us. And so ensure that your contact information is up to date. And I want to say that even though we're conducting activities a little bit differently, eventually, the workplace, whatever it looks like, is going to resume. If you work, and I'm going to use Service Canada as an example, there's many people who will be continue to remote work, and that will be their future. And so how would you like to engage in this fight? And we need your ideas based on what your employer parameters are. Also, we want to make sure that you're comfortable with doing these actions, and how can we support you? Does it mean that we have talking points for you? Does it mean that we do educationals so that you feel more confident in lobbying your MP? There's just various activities you can take. And today is going to be the first start of one of our activities. So I want to say that mobilization looks differently for different people, but I invite you all, because if those sisters, if those women who went on strike in the 80s, and 75% of them were women, self-identified women with children, if they did not go on strike, I can tell you when I started with the federal government in 1998, I wouldn't have seen the benefit of that action. And so every action helps, regardless of how small or how big, but at some point in time, we have to make this government listen. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sharon. Christina, and by the way, for everyone joining, these questions, we just didn't make them up. Obviously, these questions were garnered when you registered. We asked you to pose some questions. So that's where we got these questions from. We got them from your registration forms. So Christina, the next question is for you. Why did you decide to become part of the SV bargaining team, and how did you get involved? Christina?
Hi, thank you very much for the question. I was thinking about this one, and definitely the reason I got involved was to hold the employer accountable for education. I wanted to see, I am in the SV bargaining team does not have enough racially visible and women on that team. And in that group, in that entire group of workers, not all the subgroups included. So I kind of said, I want to see the changes, man. And who else to do it but me? That's what fueled me, was this drive that I realized no one was going to do it except me. You know what I mean? We are the union. I am the union. You are the union. It was really that. And how did I do it? Well, I took as many courses as I could. I made myself as available to learning PSAC, UNDE, and what this union was all about. I made myself available to everything. I listened, I learned, I absorbed, I shared. I met fantastic women who have supported me and championed me. I have had luckily, by the grace of, by them, I'm here, and that's how I did it. And so I would urge every woman, every racially visible person, every person belonging to an equity group, get out there, take those courses, enlist in those things, give up some evenings, give up some weekends, because oh my gosh, they're incredible. And if you can do it during the workday too, all the better. So that's what I would say to you, is just join, Anyway, okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you for that, Christina. And as Sharon was saying, you can certainly invite team members to your local meetings and that. And there you go. If you want a great speaker, a motivational speaker, invite Christina. Thank you very much, Christina, for that fantastic answer. So, Jimmy, the next question is for you. How do we assess if equity initiatives are working in our workplaces, quantitatively and quantitatively as well? Jimmy?
Wow. Tout d'abord, merci encore pour la question.
Okay, first of all, thank you for the question. I would have a long answer, but given the fact the time is short, I will give you a short answer. I'll just like to express a few ideas, hoping that they will help the person who asked the question. I would say we have to make sure that we understand the basic objectives of the employment equity programs, i.e., helping those who very often are afraid of losing their privileges. What are the objectives of the employment equity program. Make sure for equal opportunities in all aspects of employment by eliminating discrimination, eliminating obstacles to equal representation, promoting the idea that equity does not necessarily mean that everyone should be treated the same way, but rather that differences have to be taken into account and valued. I would also say that we have to make sure that we have a joint committee, an employer union committee that works in cooperation and focuses on proactive process that would support a representative workforce. We have to make sure that this committee will develop an action plan that evolves and that focuses on education, on reviewing hiring processes, and that would allow to assess the objectives under the plan. I could go on. I could go on and provide you with other elements, but I think those ones are important to really make sure that equity initiatives will be operational in your workplace. And I would just like to add that Saïd Apati, a brother who's a research officer, and I just received the mandate to look into that, among other things. And we're working with Sima Lamba, human rights officer, to look for solutions. I would also say to keep your eyes open because the Alliance will be tabling a document on all the changes made to the employment equity legislation, or that should be made. So all of that will allow us to assess from a quantitative and qualitative point of view employment equity initiatives in your workplace. Thank you. Thank you, Jimmy.
Brenda, the next question is for you. What gains have we made recently for Indigenous employees? And how are we continuing to support the fight for equity for Indigenous members this round and, of course, beyond? Brenda?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. There was a bit of feedback when you spoke. So if anyone has feedback when I'm speaking, just, I don't know, put a note in the chat or wave. So recently, at least in the last year, what we've been able to achieve is a number of things. And I look at improvements for Indigenous workers that actually benefit all of us as we achieve improvements for Indigenous workers. We improve the quality of that workplace and everyone's experience in that workplace. And I wish that's why I wish the employer would easily agree to the training on from call to action number 57 in the federal public service. But outside of the federal public service, and even it's sort of somewhat adjacent to, we have been making some advances, and they're particularly around the Indigenous or cultural practices. That's called something different in various collective agreements. They vary in duration from a couple of days to maybe 6 days. Some or all of it is paid. We've also at Wekadon Lodge in Northern Ontario, we've achieved training on annual training on Indigenous history, culture, and practices for all employees. Although a large number of workers in that work site are Indigenous, some are not, and we're not asking individual members to educate their fellow workers. We're looking for the employer to take that responsibility, and we've been having some success with that. A number of our collective agreements in the north, in the different territories, the hamlets and housing authorities, we've been able to get the employer more and more to agree to have them translated into Inuktitut or whatever the predominant dialect is for that community, in recognition that although many do have a working knowledge of English in terms of referencing their collective agreement, it's important for them to be able to read it in the language that is inherent to them, and especially when you're talking about a very remote northern community, that's more often than not the situation. We've also more and more been achieving, since the introduction of the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, have been achieving that even in new collective agreements that I'm negotiating outside of the public service. Although we haven't reached a tentative agreement yet, the employer, because it's a brand new collective agreement, when we met just prior to September 30th, they wanted to quickly get agreement from us on designated paid holidays to include that, and they actually respected it. And that was at a nonprofit organization in Toronto called The Stop. Can't vouch for them on their progressiveness on a number of other things so far, but they did agree to that, and they recognized it for workers this past September 30th, even though we don't have a collective agreement yet. So it does vary. We've been doing more and more, and in terms of support for that was the second part of the question, support for that. I think that we need to continue to push this. We need to acknowledge that we all have a role to play, regardless of our whether or not we are Indigenous, especially if we're not Indigenous, to support our Indigenous siblings in this quest and in this need for us to have this understanding of their culture, and to understand that the way we deliver services, perhaps within the federal public service, is impacted by our understanding or our acknowledgement of their history. And that can only make every workplace better by having that information, that knowledge there. Trying to think of other items. Sorry, I just went blank on the other item I wanted to talk about. But if there's Jimmy, if there's something I missed that we've talked about, jump in. But I think that's the major things certainly in most recently. But as I said, those improvements help Indigenous members, but I believe that it helps all of us. It really truly does. All the equity proposals will make the workplace hopefully fair and more accountable and transparent and objective as opposed to subjective, and will improve folks' quality of their love of their work or their situation at work.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Brenda. As I said earlier this evening, we prepared an activity, of course, for you to help us put, all of this knowledge now into action. So we've got almost 200 people still on the line with us. And obviously this provides us with a very unique opportunity to collectively make an impact. So I'm going to introduce Jill O'Reilly. Jill is PSAC's National Mobilization Officer, to introduce tonight's political action.